Probably the most important concept to understand in web development is the idea between front-end and back-end. To explain this, I want to use a diagram from Felix Tay. I'm going to go to felixtay.com/frontend versus backend. At the bottom of this article, you can find the diagram. So what we saw in the first video was me interacting with what's called the front end. And as you can see, the front end code is always written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The front end code is basically what comes together in your browser to create what you see and interact with in your browser. The reason why the code on the front end is always HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is because we all use similar web browsers like Chrome, Safari, and Firefox, and international standards had to be developed so that developers all agreed on which technologies would make up the websites we see and interact with. The front end, however, is just the tip of the iceberg, as the back end can be infinitely more complex. The role of the back end is simply to generate the front end, but in a much more intelligent way. So let's return to our example in the first video. What happens when we click reload after editing the page? The changes disappear, right? Well, of course, this makes sense. Google's not going to let us change their website. But what is actually happening when we click that reload button? The answer is that we're creating a new request to the server. When we make that request, the backend performs any number of simple or complex calculations and then sends to the browser HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These three scripts are then interpreted by your browser to generate the website that you see and interact with. In the Google example, the backend might calculate number one, which country you are accessing the website from, and number two, whether you are logged in or logged out. Whatever calculations Google may perform on the backend is completely private, and the backend code never makes it to your browser, and therefore there's no way of viewing it. Unlike the front end, a website's backend can be generated or created using any programming languages or technologies. Your browser always requires HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it doesn't really care how it gets there. It just cares that the code on the front end is readable. That being said, there are a few popular choices that power most of the web. These are PHP, Ruby, Python, Java, C, and C++. Let's return to the diagram. We've talked about the front end and the back end, but there is one other point of interaction here, and that is the database. The database is, surprise, surprise, where data is stored. So using this example in the diagram, a user might click on a button to access a photo gallery. The request is then sent to the backend, which then queries the database, and then the database will return the photo information to the backend, and then the backend will determine what to send to the browser. If everything makes sense right now, great, but if not, keep in mind that you will start to understand better once you start to work directly with the backend and front end and once we get into some code. But to finish off this section, I just wanted to share one last example that is quite common in web development, and it's a process called authentication. Now, authentication is something that you probably come across all the time. It's just a fancy word for logging in somebody and logging out someone from a website or an app. If a user is authenticated, it just means that they have been able to identify themselves and log into the site. Authentication always involves or always should involve the backend, as user information should be always served privately and it should interact with a database. Remember, everything on the backend, including the database, is not visible to the user. Only what is delivered to the front end can be viewed and interacted with. So in the case of authentication, the user, number one, types in their username and password, and then hits enter. Number two, the information is then sent to the backend, which queries the database to see if one, the username exists in the database, and two, whether the password matches what is stored for that user. Number three, if both conditions match, the backend decides that the user should be granted access and in collaboration with the front end declares the user as logged in. So, do you see now how the front end and the back end interact? Let's face it, I could throw so much more theory at you, but web development is best learned by doing. So let's jump into some code in the next video. Again, remember that you do not need to have everything super clear to jump into the next section. This is all theory that will make so much more sense when we actually get into some code. So just rewatch this video if you need to, but know that once we get through this course, the concepts that we talked about in this lesson will become clearer. So let's jump into some HTML in the next video.